When historians attempt to reconstruct the historical Jesus, they usually begin with one gospel first. Not John, not Luke, not Matthew, usually Mark. Why is this? Why would historians choose the shortest gospel, one devoid of some of the most iconic aspects of the story of Jesus? After all, Mark is the roughest, shortest, and least polished of the four Gospels contained in the New Testament. Well, what Mark lacks in polish, content, and sophistication, it may make up for in tradition and placement. For many historians, Mark represents the earliest and least developed portrait of Jesus preserved in the New Testament. And unlike the other Gospels, Mark is tied to one of the earliest surviving traditions explaining how the Gospel itself was composed. The Gospel of Mark is usually dated to around 70 CE, roughly 4 decades after Jesus' exit from the historical scene. This places its composition around the time of the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. For the Jewish world, this was a period of profound trauma and confusion, whether one followed Jesus or not. Judaism was now being forced to adapt from a temple-centered faith into something altogether different. For many followers of Jesus, this increasingly meant turning toward the teachings and memory of Jesus himself. By the time Mark was composed, the letters of Paul had already begun circulating throughout early Christian congregations. Some scholars believe traces of Pauline influence can already be detected within Mark's presentation of Jesus. Mark also appears to have served as the primary source material for the other two synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke. The three are called synoptic Gospels because they often run parallel to one another in structure, wording, and narrative order. Roughly 90% of Mark appears in Matthew, while large portions also appear in Luke. Scholar James Tabor has described Matthew and Luke as, in many ways, re-edits of Mark, adaptations customized to the needs and theological concerns of their own Christian communities. To New Testament scholars, this view on the order and composition of Matthew and Luke being dependent on Mark is called Markan priority. Being first is not the only reason historians reach for Mark. Mark may have a history. Allow me to introduce Papias of Hierapolis. He was a bishop in Hierapolis in early 2nd century, around 110 to 130 CE. Hierapolis is in modern-day Turkey and sat at the junction of the land route linking the Middle East to Rome. Papias was hungry to record the history of the church and her early apostles. He would ask every traveler through town about news from the Holy Land. He used what he had learned to write a volume detailing the development of the church. Sadly, this volume is lost. According to fragments later preserved by Eusebius, Papias claimed to have received traditions from figures connected to the earlier apostolic generation. One day, John the Elder, also known as John the Presbyter or just the Presbyter, passed through Papias' area and was questioned per Papias' habit. John related to him information regarding the composition of the Gospel of Mark. According to John the Elder, Mark was composed by John Mark. John Mark served as Peter's interpreter during his evangelical voyages. Later, John Mark became Paul's companion and was asked to record his gospel. He stated that he wrote accurately the content of all Peter's sermons, though he cautioned that they may not be in the correct order. This small bit of information on the composition of the Gospel of Mark represents our only independent account about the authorship of a gospel. It also gives us a source for the events used in Matthew and Luke, taken from Mark. If Papias' report is correct, much of our account of the ministry of Jesus comes from the sermons of Peter. Mark may represent the closest thing we possess in the New Testament to preserved memory tradition tied to identifiable individuals from the earliest Jesus movement. Not because it is pure history, and not because it is free from theology, but because it stands at the intersection of oral memory, early tradition, and the first attempts to write the story of Jesus down. This is why historians so often begin with Mark, not because it tells us everything about Jesus, but because it may preserve the earliest surviving layer of memory beneath the later theological developments of Christianity. Mark can be thought of as a first draft of a more organized Pauline Christianity. It is a condensation of the account of the ministry and teachings of Jesus purportedly given by his disciple Peter. At the time of writing, Christianity as an individual faith had not fully separated from Judaism, and many saw Jesus as a messianic teacher rather than the Savior of the world. Some historians believe Mark preserves traditions closer to the earlier Jerusalem church associated with James and Peter. For many historians, Mark represents the closest surviving record of these early traditions before Christianity became more heavily influenced by the Greek-speaking world. Historically, many scholars view Mark as the closest surviving gospel to the earliest traditions about Jesus. And we see this most clearly in what Mark does not contain. Mark does not contain any information about the birth of Jesus nor his lineage. If Mark's attribution to Peter is accurate, it is reasonable to note that this was not necessarily a large part of their gospel. Many scholars believe that the birth narrative was an early Christian way of refuting the questions surrounding Jesus' earthly father and heritage. The awaited Messiah was expected to come from the line of David. Given these expectations, accusations surrounding Jesus' legitimacy would have created serious challenges for his messianic claims. Both Matthew and Luke provide birth narratives and genealogies, although they differ greatly from each other. Mark finishes on a scene of the empty tomb. For the tradition of James and Peter, this may have been sufficient, as the majority of Jesus' teachings occurred prior to his crucifixion. As Pauline Christianity spread, communities increasingly emphasized the resurrection of Jesus and the continuation of the movement beyond crucifixion. An empty tomb alone would not necessarily have demonstrated resurrection to a first-century audience. Temporary burial before the end of the Sabbath was not unheard of in Jewish practice. The tomb did not belong to them and would have had to be vacated so it could be finished and presented to its rightful owner. Mark does not illustrate the crucial aspect of Pauline Christianity, the risen Savior. As resurrection theology became increasingly central within Christianity, later Gospels expanded these traditions with resurrection appearances and post-crucifixion narratives. Many historians also believe a third source was found and included after Mark but before Matthew and Luke. This source is visible in material that is absent from Mark but nearly identical in Matthew and Luke. Scholar calls this the Q source and is hypothesized to be a simple collection of the sayings of Jesus, much like the Gospel of Thomas. A great example of this source is the Sermon on the Mount, or also known as the Sermon on the Plain. These are made of excerpts of this possible lost third source. If true, it once again illustrates the earliest Christians' focus on the teachings of Jesus versus his nature, the focus of later believers. Later Gospels also smoothed out some of the perceived rough spots of the story that made Jesus appear human rather than a divine being. It is for this reason that historians often prefer earlier and simpler traditions, because later traditions tend to accumulate theology, interpretation, and literary development. Mark simply seems to be an account as it occurs, warts and all. Mark does not make any attempt to glorify any of the characters in his narrative. The disciples consistently misunderstand Jesus and often appear confused, fearful, or incapable of grasping his message. Peter, the man upon whom Jesus builds his church, is even rebuked. Even the star of the narrative, Jesus, is rejected by his own family and is unable to perform miracles in his own hometown. Jesus is also depicted as being both surprised and dejected when sensing his own impending death. A Hellenized audience would probably not be too inspired by these characters. One detail many New Testament scholars note about Mark is that its lack of polish and refined language make it feel unfinished and urgent. The events in the narratives are moved along quickly by the word immediately, in some fairly rough Greek. The urgency seems to be in anticipation of an immediate apocalypse. There is a notable lack of transition between the various scenes. That being said, it also contains some very vivid details and emotional descriptions. The color of the grass is noted, as is the presence of the cushion in the boat. Aramaic phrases are included, giving a taste of what the words of Jesus would have actually been. Some historians believe these details may reflect preserved oral memory, the kinds of details people remember from lived experiences. That does not prove eyewitness authorship, but it helps explain why Mark remains so important to historical Jesus research. Of course, this does not mean that Mark is perfectly historically accurate. It is still theological literature written to facilitate conversion, written decades after the events detailed. It is, however, the earliest tradition that we have, and to historians, earlier is often better. Mark matters not because it's perfect history, but because it may preserve some of the earliest surviving memories of Jesus before generations of theology reshaped the story. Before Christianity became a global religion, there was memory. And before theology became doctrine, there was Mark.